vision standing on a hillside overlooking a river valley in central Italy. The year is 753 BC. The hills are covered with simple huts and grazing sheep. The air is warm, carrying the scent of wild herbs and wood smoke. Nothing about this modest settlement suggests that it will one day rule the known world, that its laws will shape civilization for millennia, or that its name will become synonymous with empire itself. Tonight, we will trace the remarkable journey of Rome, from its legendary founding by twin brothers raised by a wolf, through its transformation into a republic that conquered the Mediterranean, to its glory as an empire that stretched from the misty forests of Britain to the scorching deserts of Arabia. We will walk through the Forum, witness the drama of the Senate, march with the legions, and explore the engineering marvels that still stand today as testaments to Roman ingenuity. This is a story of ambition and innovation, of military genius and political intrigue, of art and architecture that defined beauty for ages to come. It is also a story of decline, of how the mightiest empire the world had ever known slowly crumbled under the weight of its own success. So settle in, let the tensions of the day fade away, and allow yourself to drift back through the centuries. Let us travel to the Seven Hills, to the eternal city itself, to Rome. Every great city has a founding myth, but few are as vivid and strange as Rome's. According to legend, the story begins not in Rome at all, but in the ancient city of Alba Longa, some 15 miles to the southeast. There, a princess named Rhea Silvia served as a Vestal virgin, sworn to lifelong chastity and devotion to the goddess Vesta. Her uncle, Amulius, had seized the throne from her father and forced Rhea Silvia into this sacred role specifically to prevent her from producing heirs who might challenge his power. But the gods, as they so often did in Roman mythology, had other plans. The god Mars visited Rhea Silvia, and she gave birth to twin boys. When Amulius discovered the infants, he was furious. He ordered them to be placed in a basket and thrown into the Tiber River to drown. The servants tasked with this grim duty carried the basket to the river's edge, but the Tiber was flooding its banks. Rather than wade into the dangerous current, they simply set the basket down in the shallow overflow water and walked away, assuming nature would complete the execution. But the basket did not sink. The floodwaters receded, leaving the basket stranded on the muddy shore near the base of the Palatine Hill. There, according to the legend, a she-wolf discovered the crying infants. Rather than killing them, she nursed them as if they were her own cubs. This extraordinary scene, a wolf suckling two human babies, would become one of Rome's most enduring symbols, depicted in countless statues and reliefs throughout the empire's history. Eventually, a shepherd named Faustulus found the boys and brought them home to his wife. They raised the twins, naming them Romulus and Remus. The boys grew into strong young men, natural leaders who gathered followers among the local shepherds and herdsmen. When they learned of their true identity, they overthrew their great-uncle Amulius and restored their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa. The twins then decided to found a new city of their own on the very hills where the wolf had saved them. But here, the legend takes a darker turn. The brothers disagreed about which hill should be the site of the city and who should rule it. Romulus favoured the Palatine Hill, while Remus preferred the Aventine. They turned to augury, the reading of divine signs in the flight of birds, to settle the dispute. Remus saw 6 vultures first, but then Romulus saw 12. Each claimed victory, and the argument escalated into violence. In a rage, Romulus killed his brother. Filled with grief but determined to continue, Romulus marked out the boundaries of his new city with a plough and named it after himself. The date, according to Roman tradition, was April 21st, 753 BC. This founding myth, with its themes of divine intervention, fraternal conflict, and blood sacrifice, reveals much about how the Romans understood themselves. They were children of war, saved by the wild, and born from violence. The she-wolf became their symbol, embodying both the nurturing and the savage aspects of their character. Modern archaeology tells a different, though no less fascinating, story. The hills along the Tiber had been inhabited for centuries before the traditional founding date. Archaeological evidence shows pastoral communities living in the area as early as 1000 BC. These were simple settlements of thatched huts, home to farmers and shepherds who grazed their flocks on the hillsides and grew crops in the valleys. Around the 8th century BC, these separate hilltop villages began to coalesce into a single community. The process was gradual, driven by the practical advantages of cooperation and the natural growth of population. The Palatine Hill, later the site of imperial palaces, was indeed one of the earliest centers of settlement. The valley between the hills, which would become the Roman Forum, served as a meeting place and marketplace where the different communities could trade and interact. The real founding of Rome, then, was not a single dramatic event, but a slow process of urbanization. Yet the power of the founding myth persisted throughout Roman history. Every year, on April 21st, the Romans celebrated Perilia, the festival of Rome's birthday. The legend of Romulus and Remus gave Rome a divine origin, a sacred beginning that set it apart from other cities. It was a story the Romans never tired of telling, a reminder that their city had been destined for greatness from its very first day. Rome's earliest period of government was a monarchy. According to tradition, Rome had 7 kings who ruled between the legendary founding in 753 BC and the establishment of the Republic in 509 BC. These kings were not hereditary monarchs, but elected leaders chosen by the people and confirmed by the Senate, an advisory council of elder statesmen from Rome's leading families. The first king, of course, was Romulus himself. The legends tell us that after establishing the city, Romulus faced an immediate problem. His new settlement had plenty of men, the shepherds and outcasts who had flocked to join him, but very few women. Without women, the city would die in a generation. Romulus devised a cunning, if morally questionable, solution. He invited the neighboring Sabine people to a grand festival in Rome. While the Sabines were distracted by the festivities, the Romans seized their young women and carried them off. The Sabines, understandably outraged, prepared for war. But before the armies could fully engage, the Sabine women themselves intervened. They had, over time, grown attached to their Roman husbands and had borne children. They rushed between the two armies, begging their fathers and brothers on one side and their husbands on the other to make peace. Moved by this appeal, the Romans and Sabines agreed to merge into a single people. This story, known as the Rape of the Sabines, was seen by the Romans as the origin of their inclusive approach to citizenship, their willingness to incorporate conquered peoples into their society. The second king, Numa Pompilius, provided a stark contrast to the warlike Romulus. Numa was remembered as a deeply religious and peaceful ruler who established many of Rome's most important religious institutions and practices. He created the calendar, organized the priesthoods, and built the Temple of Janus, whose doors would be kept open in times of war and closed during peace. During Numa's reign, it was said, the doors remained closed, a rare period of tranquility in Rome's otherwise martial history. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, returned to Rome's military roots. His name means hostile, and he lived up to it, pursuing an aggressive policy of expansion that brought neighboring cities under Roman control. Under Tullus, Rome began its transformation from a simple hill town into a regional power. The fourth king, Ancus Marcius, was said to be the grandson of Numa and combined his grandfather's piety with the military vigor of Tullus. He expanded Roman territory further and significantly established the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber, giving Rome direct access to the sea and transforming it into a maritime as well as a land power. The last three kings were all Etruscans, members of the sophisticated civilization that dominated central Italy before Rome's rise. The Etruscans were more advanced than the early Romans, with developed urban planning, monumental architecture, and extensive trade networks. The Etruscan kings brought these innovations to Rome, transforming it from a collection of rustic villages into a true city. Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king, undertook massive building projects. He constructed the great sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, which drained the marshy valley between the hills and made possible the development of the Forum. He also began the construction of the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, which would become the most important religious site in Rome. Servius Tullius, the sixth king, is credited with establishing Rome's political and military organization. He created the census, dividing the citizens into classes based on wealth and determining their military obligations accordingly. He also built a great defensive wall around the city, portions of which still survive today. The seventh and final king, Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, was remembered as a tyrant. He ruled without consulting the Senate, used violence against his enemies, and pursued his own glory at the expense of the people's welfare. His reign came to an abrupt and dramatic end. The story goes that Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped Lucretia, the virtuous wife of a Roman nobleman. Lucretia, though blameless in the attack, felt her honor was destroyed. She summoned her father and husband, told them what had happened, and then stabbed herself to death before their eyes. Her final words were a plea that they avenge her. This tragedy sparked a revolution. Lucius Junius Brutus, a relative of Lucretia, led an uprising against the king. He displayed Lucretia's body in the Forum and denounced the tyranny of the Tarquins. The people, long resentful of Tarquin's abuses, rallied to Brutus. They drove the royal family from Rome and swore a collective oath that they would never again allow a king to rule over them. The date was 509 BC. The Age of Kings was over. The Roman Republic had begun. The expulsion of the kings represented one of the most important turning points in Roman history. The Romans did not simply replace one form of autocracy with another. Instead, they created a complex system of government designed specifically to prevent any single person from gaining too much power. This system, the Roman Republic, would endure for nearly 500 years. At the heart of the Republic were the consuls, two men elected annually to serve as the chief executives of the state. The dual nature of the consulship was crucial. Each consul could veto the other's actions, preventing unilateral decisions. They held office for only 1 year, ensuring that power remained temporary rather than permanent. After their year in office, they returned to being private citizens, though they joined the Senate and often influenced policy for decades to come. The Senate itself was the true power center of the Republic. Composed of former magistrates and members of Rome's most prominent families, the Senate controlled foreign policy, managed the treasury, and assigned provinces and armies to generals. While technically an advisory body, the Senate's authority was so great that its recommendations were almost always followed. A senator served for life, creating continuity and institutional memory that elected officials could not provide. Below the consuls were various other magistrates, each with specific responsibilities. Praetors administered justice, aediles managed public works and festivals, quaestors handled financial matters, and censors conducted the census and oversaw public morals. All of these positions were elected, and all were temporary, creating a system of checks and balances that made concentrating power extremely difficult. But the Republic was not a democracy in the modern sense. Voting was organized by groups, not individuals, and wealth determined how much influence a person's vote carried. The wealthiest citizens voted first, and their votes counted for more. The poor, while technically citizens, had little real political power. This inequality created tension from the very beginning. Roman society was divided into two classes. The patricians were the aristocratic families who traced their lineage back to Rome's earliest days. They monopolized political power, controlled the Senate, and held most of the wealth. The plebeians were everyone else, the common people who made up the majority of Rome's population. They were farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and laborers. They fought in Rome's armies and paid taxes, but they were excluded from the highest positions of power. The plebeians were not content to remain second-class citizens. In 494 BC, just 15 years after the founding of the Republic, they staged what became known as the First Secession of the Plebs. Faced with debt, poverty, and political exclusion, the plebeians simply left Rome. They withdrew to the Sacred Mount, a hill outside the city, and refused to return. This was a crisis. Without the plebeians, Rome had no army and no workforce. The patricians were forced to negotiate. They agreed to create a new office, the tribune of the plebs, whose sole purpose was to protect plebeian interests. Tribunes had the power to veto any action by a magistrate or the Senate that they believed harmed the plebeians. Their persons were sacred and inviolable, and any attack on a tribune was punishable by death. This was just the first victory in what would become known as the conflict of the orders, a long struggle between patricians and plebeians that lasted for over 200 years. In 451 to 450 BC, the plebeians won another major concession. The laws, which had previously been known only to patrician priests who could interpret them as they wished, were written down on 12 bronze tablets and publicly displayed in the Forum. These 12 tables became the foundation of Roman law, and every Roman schoolboy memorized them. Gradually, through a combination of political agitation and compromise, the plebeians won more rights. They gained the right to marry patricians, to hold the consulship, and eventually to enter the Senate. By 287 BC, when the conflict of the orders finally ended with the passage of the Lex Hortensia, which made decisions of plebeian assemblies binding on all Romans, the plebeians had achieved legal equality with the patricians. This gradual expansion of rights did not make Rome a democracy. Power still concentrated in the hands of the wealthy, but it created a more inclusive oligarchy, a broader ruling class that gave talented and ambitious men from outside the old patrician families a path to power. This flexibility, this ability to adapt and incorporate new people and ideas, would become one of Rome's greatest strengths. While Rome was developing its republican institutions, it was also fighting for its very survival. The early republic was surrounded by enemies. To the north were the Etruscans, still powerful and resentful of Rome's growing independence. To the east and south were other Latin cities, suspicious of Rome's ambitions. And in the hills were the Samnites, fierce warriors who controlled much of central and southern Italy. Rome's approach to these challenges was methodical and patient. The Romans did not seek to conquer and subjugate their neighbors in the manner of later empires. Instead, they built a complex network of alliances offering different terms to different communities. Some became full Roman citizens, others received partial citizenship with rights to trade and intermarry with Romans but without the right to vote. Still others became allies, maintaining their own governments, but required to provide troops to Rome in time of war. This flexible system allowed Rome to expand without creating a unified opposition. Conquered peoples often found Roman rule preferable to their previous circumstances, especially since Rome generally did not interfere in local affairs as long as tribute was paid and troops were provided. Over time, many allied communities aspired to Roman citizenship, seeing it as a privilege rather than an imposition. The conquest of Italy was not easy. In 390 BC, Rome suffered one of the greatest disasters in its history when a Gallic army swept down from the north, defeated the Roman legions, and sacked the city itself. The Gauls occupied Rome for months, destroying much of the city and carrying off enormous amounts of loot. Only the Capitoline Hill, where the defenders held out in the fortified citadel, remained in Roman hands. According to legend, when the Gauls attempted a nighttime assault on the citadel, the sacred geese of Juno cackled an alarm, waking the defenders and saving Rome from complete destruction. The Gauls eventually withdrew, not because they were defeated, but because they had achieved their goal of plunder. But the trauma of the sack left a lasting mark on Roman consciousness. From that day forward, the Romans harbored a deep fear of the northern barbarians and an iron determination that Rome would never again be so vulnerable. The city was quickly rebuilt, and Rome emerged from the catastrophe more united and more militaristic than before. The stone walls that had failed to protect the city were reconstructed stronger and higher. Military reforms strengthened the legions, and Rome's expansion accelerated. The Samnite Wars, a series of conflicts fought between 343 and 290 BC, proved to be the crucial test. The Samnites were formidable opponents, masters of mountain warfare, who inflicted several humiliating defeats on Roman armies. At one point, a Roman army was trapped in a narrow pass at the Caudine Forks and forced to surrender. The Samnites made the Roman soldiers pass under a yoke of spears, a ritual gesture of submission that mortified the proud Romans. But Rome never gave up. After each defeat, the Romans learned, adapted, and came back stronger. They built roads to move troops more quickly. They reformed their tactics to fight more effectively in rough terrain. And they persevered with a stubbornness that would become legendary. By 290 BC, the Samnites were defeated. By 275 BC, after a war against the Greek city of Tarentum and its ally, King Pyrrhus of Epirus, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po River. The Romans had proven that they could defeat not only their Italian neighbors, but also the professional armies of the Hellenistic world. Rome was no longer a regional power. It was the dominant force in Italy, with a manpower base larger than any other state in the Mediterranean. The stage was set for Rome to step onto the world stage. Rome's transformation from Italian power to Mediterranean empire came through its 3 wars with Carthage, collectively known as the Punic Wars. These conflicts, spanning more than a century, were among the most consequential in ancient history. Carthage was everything Rome was not. Where Rome was a land power, Carthage ruled the seas. Where Rome was a republic of citizen soldiers, Carthage was a merchant oligarchy that hired mercenaries to fight its wars. Carthage was wealthy beyond measure, its merchants trading in tin from Britain, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, and precious metals from Spain. The city itself, located on the coast of North Africa in what is now Tunisia, was one of the most magnificent in the ancient world, with triple walls, artificial harbours, and temples gleaming with gold. The First Punic War began in 264 BC as a dispute over Sicily. Rome had never been a naval power, while Carthage's fleet was the finest in the Mediterranean. But the Romans, with characteristic determination, decided to build a navy. They copied a Carthaginian warship that had run aground on the Italian coast, reverse engineering its design. Within 60 days, they had constructed a fleet of over 100 warships. The Romans lacked naval experience, but they found a creative solution. They invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that could be dropped onto enemy ships. This device transformed naval combat into something more like a land battle, where Roman soldiers could use their superior fighting skills. In battle after battle, the corvus gave Rome the advantage. The war dragged on for 23 years, fought primarily in Sicily and the surrounding waters. The Romans suffered terrible losses, with entire fleets destroyed in storms. but they always rebuilt, always returned. Finally, in 241 BC, Rome won a decisive naval victory off the Aegates Islands. Carthage, exhausted and bankrupt, sued for peace. The treaty terms were harsh. Carthage had to evacuate Sicily, pay a massive indemnity, and agree not to attack Rome's allies. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, a territory governed directly by Rome rather than through alliance. It was the beginning of Rome's transformation into an imperial power. But peace did not last. In the years following the First Punic War, a brilliant young Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca nursed a burning hatred for Rome. His father, Hamilcar, had made young Hannibal swear an oath at the altar of the gods that he would forever be Rome's enemy. Hannibal never forgot. In 218 BC, Hannibal launched one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. Rather than attack Rome by sea, where Roman naval power was now supreme, he marched his army from Spain, through southern Gaul, and over the Alps into Italy itself. He brought with him war elephants, those massive beasts that terrified the Romans, who had never seen such creatures before. The crossing of the Alps was a nightmare. The mountain passes were barely wide enough for the elephants. The local tribes attacked the column. Rock slides and avalanches killed thousands. Of the 38 elephants that began the journey, only a handful survived. But Hannibal and the core of his army made it through. For the next 15 years, Hannibal ravaged Italy. He won victory after stunning victory, at the Trebia River, at Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cannae in 216 BC, where he destroyed a Roman army of over 80,000 men in one of the most perfect tactical victories in military history. After Cannae, it seemed Rome must fall. Many of Rome's Italian allies defected to Hannibal, but Rome itself never surrendered. The Senate refused even to discuss peace terms. Instead, they adopted a strategy of attrition, avoiding major battles while gradually wearing Hannibal down, cutting off his supplies, and recapturing allied cities one by one. The man who turned the tide was Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. Rather than continuing to fight Hannibal in Italy, Scipio took the war to Africa, attacking Carthage itself. Hannibal was recalled from Italy to defend his homeland. The two generals met in 202 BC at the Battle of Zama. This time, it was the Romans who had the superior cavalry, and it was a Roman general who outmaneuvered his opponent. Scipio won a complete victory, Hannibal fled, and Carthage once again sued for peace. The Second Punic War was over. Rome had not just survived, but emerged stronger than ever. Carthage was stripped of its overseas territories and reduced to a minor regional power. Rome now controlled Spain, Sicily, and Sardinia, and its reputation for military prowess spread throughout the Mediterranean world. For the next 50 years, Rome consolidated its power, defeating the Macedonian kingdoms and establishing dominance over the Greek city-states. But Carthage's very existence still troubled Rome. Cato the Elder, an influential senator, ended every speech he gave with the words, "Carthago delenda est." Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BC, Rome provoked a third and final war with Carthage. The Carthaginians, despite being vastly outmatched, defended their city with desperate courage. The siege lasted 3 years. When Roman troops finally breached the walls in 146 BC, the fighting continued, house to house, room to room. The Carthaginians fought to the last, preferring death to surrender. When the battle finally ended, the Romans methodically destroyed the city. They burned it, tore down the walls, plowed the ruins with salt so that nothing would grow there again. Carthage, the magnificent rival that had challenged Rome for supremacy of the Mediterranean, ceased to exist. The same year, Rome also destroyed Corinth, one of the great cities of Greece, as a warning to other Greek states. The message was clear. Rome was not just another Mediterranean power. It was the supreme power, and resistance was futile. Rome's military conquests brought unimaginable wealth. Gold and silver flowed into the city. Slaves from conquered territories worked Roman estates. The Mediterranean had become, in effect, a Roman lake. But this success created profound social and political problems that would ultimately destroy the Republic. The traditional Roman economy had been based on small family farms, worked by citizen soldiers who would leave their fields to fight in Rome's armies and then return home after each campaign. But the long wars of conquest, particularly Hannibal's 15 years in Italy, had devastated these small farms. Many had been destroyed. Many others had been bought up by the wealthy while the soldiers were away. The rich invested their war profits in large estates worked by slaves. These latifundia, as they were called, could produce crops far more cheaply than small farmers. The result was that many Roman citizens lost their land and migrated to the city, swelling the population of urban poor who depended on the state for food and employment. This created a political crisis. The traditional Roman system assumed that citizens were independent property owners with a stake in the stability of the state. But now, a growing proportion of citizens owned nothing and had no secure livelihood. They were a potentially dangerous force that ambitious politicians could mobilize for their own purposes. The crisis came to a head in 133 BC when Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune. Tiberius proposed land reform, redistributing public land that had been illegally occupied by the wealthy to landless citizens. It was a popular proposal with the poor, but threatened the interests of the senatorial class. When Tiberius tried to push his reforms through over senatorial opposition and then sought an unprecedented second term as tribune, his opponents in the Senate organized a mob that killed him and 300 of his supporters. It was the first time in the Republic's history that political disagreement had led to the murder of a magistrate in office. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, was elected tribune and attempted to continue his brother's reforms, proposing not just land redistribution, but also subsidized grain for the urban poor and extended rights for Italian allies. He too was killed in political violence, along with 3,000 of his supporters. The Gracchi brothers' deaths marked the beginning of the end of the Republic. They showed that the traditional rules and norms of Roman politics could no longer contain the tensions created by Rome's transformation from a city-state to an empire. Political competition increasingly took the form of violence rather than debate. The next century saw a succession of military strongmen who used their armies and the support of the urban poor to dominate politics. Marius, a brilliant general from a non-aristocratic family, reformed the army by recruiting landless volunteers and creating a professional military loyal to its commander rather than to the state. Sulla, another general, used his troops to march on Rome itself and seize power, establishing a precedent that would be followed by others. The Senate, which had governed Rome effectively for centuries, lost control. Power shifted to whoever could command the most legions and promise the most to the people. The stage was set for the rise of individuals who would make themselves masters of Rome. Julius Caesar was born into an aristocratic but not particularly wealthy family in 100 BC. His early career followed the traditional cursus honorum, the sequence of offices that ambitious Romans pursued. But Caesar was not content with traditional success. He was brilliant, ruthless, and possessed of an ambition that would accept nothing less than supreme power. In 59 BC, Caesar was elected consul. He formed an informal alliance with two other powerful men, Pompey and Crassus, known to history as the First Triumvirate. After his consulship, Caesar obtained the governorship of Gaul, the region corresponding roughly to modern France. It was here that Caesar made his reputation. For 9 years, from 58 to 50 BC, Caesar campaigned in Gaul. He fought the Gallic tribes, crossed the Rhine into Germany, and even invaded Britain twice. His military genius was undeniable. He won battle after battle, often against overwhelming odds. By the end of his campaigns, he had conquered all of Gaul, adding vast territories to the Roman Empire and acquiring enormous wealth and a loyal, battle-hardened army absolutely devoted to him. Caesar's success made him extremely popular with the Roman people, but also made him extremely threatening to the Senate. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, had turned against him, siding with the Senate. In 50 BC, the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar knew that if he obeyed, his enemies would prosecute him and destroy him politically. On January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy proper. Roman law forbade any general from bringing his army across this river into Italy. To do so was an act of war against the Republic. Caesar hesitated. Then, according to the historian Suetonius, he uttered the famous words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. He led his army across the river. Civil war erupted. Pompey and most of the Senate fled to Greece, where they assembled an army to oppose Caesar. But Caesar's veterans proved superior. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar destroyed Pompey's forces. Pompey himself fled to Egypt, where he was murdered by the young pharaoh's advisors who hoped to win Caesar's favor. Caesar followed Pompey to Egypt, where he became embroiled in a local civil war between Pharaoh Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra. Caesar sided with Cleopatra, defeating her brother and installing her as queen. He and Cleopatra became lovers, and she bore him a son. Over the next 3 years, Caesar defeated the remaining forces of his enemies in Africa and Spain. By 45 BC, he was the undisputed master of Rome. He had himself appointed dictator, initially for 10 years, then for life. He flooded the Senate with his own supporters. He planned vast building projects. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that is the basis of our modern system. He seemed invincible, but many senators believed that Caesar intended to make himself king, a title the Romans had hated since the expulsion of Tarquin 500 years earlier. A conspiracy formed, led by men who called themselves the Liberators. They included Brutus and Cassius, both former supporters of Pompey, whom Caesar had pardoned and elevated to high office. On the Ides of March 15th, 44 BC, the conspirators struck. As Caesar arrived at the Senate house, they surrounded him and stabbed him 23 times. According to legend, Caesar saw Brutus among his attackers and said in Greek, "Kai su teknon," "You too, child." Then he pulled his toga over his head and died at the base of Pompey's statue. The conspirators expected the people to rejoice at the tyrant's death and the restoration of the Republic, but the people mourned Caesar. The army remained loyal to his memory, and Caesar had adopted his great-nephew Octavian as his heir, leaving him both his name and his fortune. The conspirators had killed Caesar, but they had not killed his legacy. The republic they thought they were saving was already dead. The future belonged to emperors. Octavian was just 18 years old when he learned of Caesar's assassination and his own adoption. The Senate expected him to be easily manipulated. They were wrong. Over the next decade and a half, Octavian proved himself to be one of the most brilliant and ruthless political operators in history. He formed an alliance with Mark Antony, Caesar's former lieutenant, and Lepidus, another of Caesar's supporters. This second triumvirate hunted down and killed the conspirators who had murdered Caesar. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, Brutus and Cassius were defeated and committed suicide. But the alliance between Octavian and Antony could not last. They were too ambitious, and there was not enough room for both at the top. Antony went to the eastern provinces, where he became involved with Cleopatra, the same queen who had been Caesar's lover. Together, they appeared to be building an independent power base. Octavian used this to portray Antony as a traitor who had abandoned Rome for an Oriental queen. In 31 BC, the forces of Octavian and Antony met at the Battle of Actium, a naval engagement off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant general Agrippa, won a decisive victory. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where both committed suicide the following year. Octavian was now the sole master of Rome, but he had learned from Caesar's mistake. He did not declare himself dictator or king. Instead, in 27 BC, he gave a carefully staged performance before the Senate, offering to restore the Republic and resign all his powers. The Senate, whose members were mostly his own supporters, refused. Instead, they granted him a collection of powers and titles that, taken together, made him effectively an emperor while allowing him to claim he was merely the first citizen, the princeps. They gave him the honorary name Augustus, meaning the revered one. He controlled the armies, appointed governors for key provinces, and held the authority of a tribune, allowing him to veto any action. but he carefully maintained the fiction that the Republic still existed, and that he was simply one magistrate among many. This careful balance worked brilliantly. Augustus ruled for 41 years until his death in 14 AD. During his reign, he brought peace to the Roman world after a century of civil wars. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, allowed trade to flourish, cities to grow, and culture to bloom. Augustus transformed Rome from a city of brick into a city of marble. He built temples, forums, and monuments that still stand today. He patronized poets like Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, an epic poem that traced Rome's origins to the Trojan hero Aeneas, and established a founding myth that rivaled that of Romulus and Remus. He established efficient administration throughout the empire, creating a professional civil service and regularizing tax collection. Under Augustus and his successors, Roman engineering reached its apex. The Romans built roads that connected every corner of the empire, many of which are still in use today. They constructed aqueducts that brought fresh water from distant mountains to cities. They erected amphitheaters, bathhouses, and temples that demonstrated Roman power and sophistication. The Colosseum, completed in 80 AD under the Emperor Titus, could hold 50,000 spectators for gladiatorial games. The Pantheon, rebuilt by Hadrian, featured a dome that remained the largest in the world for over 1,000 years. The baths of Caracalla covered 27 acres and could accommodate 1,600 bathers at once, offering not just bathing facilities, but libraries, gardens, and art galleries. Roman law evolved into a sophisticated system of jurisprudence that emphasized written codes, professional judges, and rational principles. The concept that a person is innocent until proven guilty comes from Roman law. The idea of natural law, of universal principles of justice that transcend individual societies, was developed by Roman legal theorists. The empire at its height under Trajan in 117 AD stretched from Scotland to the Sahara, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. It encompassed an estimated 50 to 70 million people, about 1/5 of the world's population at that time. Trade goods from as far away as China and sub-Saharan Africa flowed into Roman markets. For the peoples living within the empire, Roman rule often brought tangible benefits. Cities were built or expanded, bringing urban amenities to regions that had known only rural life. Roman law provided a framework for resolving disputes. Roman roads allowed easier travel and trade. Roman military might suppress bandits and pirates, making travel safer. The empire was remarkably cosmopolitan. An African could become emperor, as Septimius Severus did in 193 AD. A Syrian could join the Senate. A Greek could become a philosopher patronized by the imperial court. Citizenship eventually extended to most free inhabitants of the empire. Yet, even at its height, the empire faced fundamental challenges. The very size that made Rome great also made it vulnerable. The borders, stretching thousands of miles, required massive armies to defend. These armies had to be paid and supplied, creating an enormous financial burden. The empire's economy rested on slavery and conquest. Slaves worked the estates, built the monuments, and rowed the galleys. But as the empire stopped expanding in the 2nd century AD, the supply of new slaves from conquests dried up. Without constant expansion, the economic model became unsustainable. The emperors who followed Augustus varied wildly in quality. Some, like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, were capable administrators and military leaders. Others, like Caligula and Nero, were erratic, cruel, or simply incompetent. The principle of hereditary succession meant that Rome's fate often depended on the accidents of birth and biology. In the 3rd century AD, the empire entered a period of crisis. Between 235 and 284 AD, there were more than 50 emperors, most of whom died violently. The frontiers came under increasing pressure from Germanic tribes in the north and the new Persian Sassanid Empire in the east. Plague swept through the empire, killing millions. The economy contracted, with rampant inflation and declining trade. Emperor Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 AD, attempted to stabilize the empire through radical reforms. He divided the empire into eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor and subordinate Caesar, creating what became known as the Tetrarchy. He fixed prices and wages to combat inflation, restructured the military, and reformed the tax system. He also launched the last and most severe persecution of Christians, whom he saw as a threat to traditional Roman values. Diocletian's successor, Constantine, took a very different approach to Christianity. In 312 AD, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly saw a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He won the battle and converted to Christianity, becoming the first Christian emperor. In 313 AD, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious freedom throughout the empire. Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople. This city, strategically located on the Bosphorus between Europe and Asia, would become the center of the eastern half of the empire. The decision to move the capital symbolized a broader shift. The center of power was moving eastward, away from the traditional Roman heartland. The western half of the empire faced mounting challenges. Germanic tribes, pushed by the migration of the Huns from Central Asia, pressed against the frontiers. In 378 AD, the Visigoths defeated and killed the Emperor Valens at the Battle of Adrianople, the worst Roman military disaster in centuries. Rome was sacked by the Visigoths in 410 AD, the first time in 800 years that the city had fallen to a foreign enemy. The shock waves spread throughout the empire. If Rome itself could fall, what was safe? The great Christian theologian Augustine wrote The City of God, partly in response to this catastrophe, arguing that earthly cities rise and fall, but the city of God endures forever. In 476 AD, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and declared himself king of Italy. The Western Roman Empire was finished. The date is often given as the end of ancient history and the beginning of the Middle Ages. But Rome did not entirely die. The Eastern Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years, finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. And even in the West, Roman influence persisted. The Catholic Church preserved Latin as its liturgical language. Roman law formed the basis of legal systems throughout Europe. Roman architecture inspired builders for centuries. The very concept of empire, of a universal political order bringing diverse peoples under a single government, remained a powerful ideal. To truly understand Rome, we must step away from the grand narratives of emperors and battles and look at how ordinary Romans actually lived. What was it like to wake up in Rome on an ordinary day during the height of the empire? For most Romans, the day began early. The city came alive with the sun. There were no streetlights, and lamp oil was expensive, so people tended to sleep after dark and rise with the dawn. In the crowded apartment blocks called insulae that housed most of the city's population, space was at a premium. A typical family might occupy a single room, or at most a small apartment of 2 or 3 rooms. These insulae were notoriously unsafe. Built cheaply of wood and brick, they rose 5 or 6 stories high, with the poorest families living in the upper floors. Fire was a constant danger. The buildings were poorly maintained, and collapses were common enough that the satirist Juvenal joked that one needed courage just to live in Rome. The upper floors had no running water, so residents had to carry water up from fountains in the street or buy it from water carriers. The wealthy, of course, lived very differently. Their homes were spacious domus, houses built around a central courtyard called an atrium. These homes featured running water supplied by the city's aqueducts, heated floors in winter, decorated walls with colorful frescoes, and elaborate gardens. Some of the grandest houses even had private libraries and art galleries. Breakfast was typically light, perhaps some bread dipped in wine or honey. The main meal of the day, the cena, was eaten in the afternoon. For the poor, this might be a simple grain porridge called pulse. The better off enjoyed more variety: bread, olives, cheese, vegetables, and if they were fortunate, some fish or meat. The wealthy indulged in elaborate banquets that could last for hours. They reclined on couches while slaves brought course after course. Dormice stuffed with pork and pine nuts, flamingo tongues, peacock, oysters from Britain. These exotic delicacies demonstrated wealth and sophistication. Some hosts provided entertainment: musicians, dancers, poetry readings, or even philosophical discussions. The Forum served as the heart of Roman public life. It was marketplace, courthouse, and political arena all in one. Imagine the scene on a typical morning. Merchants set up their stalls, selling everything from vegetables to imported silks. Lawyers and their clients gathered at the basilicas to argue cases. Politicians gave speeches from the rostra, the speaker's platform decorated with the prows of captured ships. The noise would have been incredible. People arguing, bargaining, gossiping, street vendors crying their wares, the clang of metalworkers' hammers, the lowing of animals being driven to market. Latin would have been the dominant language, but you would have heard Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, and a dozen other tongues. Rome was a cosmopolitan city, filled with people from every corner of the empire and beyond. The public baths were another central institution of Roman life. By the imperial period, Rome had hundreds of bathhouses, ranging from simple neighborhood establishments to massive imperial complexes like the baths of Caracalla or Diocletian. These were not just places to wash. They were social centers where Romans of all classes mingled, though men and women bathed separately or at different times. A typical visit to the baths followed a set pattern. You would begin in the changing room, the apoditerium, where you would leave your clothes with an attendant or slave. Then you would move through a series of heated rooms. The tepidarium was warm, the caldarium hot and steamy. After sweating, bathers would scrape their skin with a curved metal tool called a strigil, removing dirt and dead skin. Then came a plunge into the cold pool, the frigidarium, to close the pores and refresh the body. The larger bath complexes offered much more than bathing. They had exercise yards, libraries, gardens, and shops. You could get a massage, have your hair cut, eat a meal, or meet with friends. Some bathhouses even had theatrical performances or lectures. For a small entrance fee, any Roman citizen could spend an entire afternoon in comfort and luxury. Entertainment in Rome could be spectacular and often brutal. The most famous venue was, of course, the Colosseum. This enormous amphitheater, capable of holding 50,000 spectators, hosted gladiatorial combats, wild animal hunts, and elaborate staged battles. The opening games in 80 AD lasted for 100 days and saw thousands of gladiators and animals killed. Gladiators were usually slaves or condemned criminals, though some free men volunteered for the profession, drawn by the potential for fame and wealth. They trained in special schools and fought in different styles. The Mumilo wore heavy armor and carried a large shield. The Retiarius fought with a net and trident, wearing almost no armor. The Thraex carried a small shield and curved sword. The crowd had favorites, and successful gladiators could become celebrities. Not all combat ended in death. Gladiators represented significant investments in training and equipment. The decision whether to spare or kill a defeated fighter rested with the sponsor of the games, though he usually let the crowd influence his decision. The image of thumbs up or down comes from this practice, though historians debate the exact gesture used. The Circus Maximus hosted chariot races, Rome's most popular sport. This enormous venue could hold 200,000 spectators. Charioteers, racing teams of 4 horses, careered around the track at breakneck speeds, often crashing into each other or the central barrier. Fans organized into factions identified by colors: blue, green, red, and white. These factions were more than sports teams. They were social and political organizations that could wield real power. Riots between factions were not uncommon. Women in Roman society occupied a complex position. They could not vote or hold political office, but they were not secluded as women were in some ancient societies. Upper-class women could own property, run businesses, and exercise considerable influence through their husbands and sons. Some, like Livia, wife of Augustus, or Agrippina, mother of Nero, were powerful political figures in their own right. Education was valued, at least for boys from wealthy families. They learned to read and write, studied Greek and Latin literature, practiced rhetoric and public speaking. The goal was to prepare them for public life, for careers in law, politics, or the military. Girls typically received less formal education, though daughters of the elite were often well educated, particularly in literature and music. Religion permeated Roman life. The Roman pantheon included dozens of gods and goddesses, many borrowed from the Greeks. Jupiter, the king of the gods, corresponded to Greek Zeus. Venus, goddess of love, to Aphrodite. Mars, the god of war, gave his name to the month of March and was particularly important to militaristic Rome. But Roman religion was about more than the great gods. It included countless minor deities and spirits. Every home had its household gods, the lares and penates, who protected the family. Every river, grove, and mountain had its presiding spirit. The boundaries of fields were protected by gods. There were gods for every activity, from baking bread to opening doors. Religious practice focused on maintaining the Pax Deorum, peace with the gods through proper ritual. Sacrifices, usually of animals, but also of wine, grain, or incense, were offered at temples throughout the city. Priests, who were public officials rather than a separate clergy, oversaw these rituals. Augurs interpreted the will of the gods by observing the flight of birds or examining the entrails of sacrificed animals. The rise of Christianity posed a fundamental challenge to this system. Christians refused to participate in traditional Roman religious rituals, including the imperial cult that required sacrifices to the genius of the emperor. To the Romans, this was not just religious deviance, but a threat to the social and political order. Christians were periodically persecuted, blamed for natural disasters and other misfortunes that the gods might send to punish Roman impiety. The most severe persecution occurred under Diocletian in the early 4th century. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, and Christians were required to sacrifice to the traditional gods or face imprisonment or death. Many Christians chose martyrdom rather than renounce their faith. Stories of these martyrs, their courage in the face of lions and fire, became powerful tools for spreading the faith. Constantine's conversion transformed Christianity from a persecuted minority religion into the favored faith of the empire. By the end of the 4th century, under Emperor Theodosius, Christianity became the official state religion. The old temples were closed or converted to churches. The ancient gods, who had watched over Rome for 1,000 years, were dethroned. No aspect of Roman civilization was more important to its success than its army. The legions were the instrument through which Rome conquered the Mediterranean world, and they remained the foundation of imperial power. Understanding the Roman military helps explain both Rome's rise and its eventual fall. The early Roman army was a citizen militia. Every property-owning Roman male was liable for military service. The army assembled for campaigns and then disbanded afterward, with soldiers returning to their farms and civilian occupations. This system worked well when Rome's wars were local and seasonal, but as Rome's campaigns extended in duration and distance, requiring armies to spend years far from Italy, the old system broke down. The solution came from the general Marius in the late 2nd century BC. He opened military service to landless volunteers, creating a professional army. Soldiers enlisted for 20 years and were paid regular wages. Upon retirement, they received a grant of land or a monetary bonus. This created an effective fighting force, but it also created a new problem. Soldiers became more loyal to their generals, who provided their pay and retirement benefits, than to the state. A Roman legion at full strength consisted of about 5,000 men organized into 10 cohorts. Each cohort contained 6 centuries of 80 men, despite the name suggesting 100. The legion was a flexible, sophisticated fighting unit capable of operating as a single mass or breaking into smaller, independent groups. The backbone of the legion was the legionary, a heavily armored infantryman. He wore a helmet, a breastplate of overlapping iron plates called lorica segmentata, and carried a large rectangular shield called a scutum. His primary weapons were the gladius, a short stabbing sword ideal for close combat, and the pilum, a heavy javelin designed to pierce shields and armor. Roman tactics emphasized discipline, coordination, and adaptability. Legionaries trained constantly, practicing formations, mock combat, and building fortifications. Every legion on campaign built a fortified camp each night, complete with ditches, ramparts, and gates laid out in a standard pattern. This meant that even in enemy territory, Roman soldiers slept in a secure, familiar environment. The legion's flexibility was its great strength. It could form a defensive square if surrounded, extend into a long line to match a larger enemy force, or concentrate into a dense wedge for a breakthrough. The famous testudo or tortoise formation had soldiers overlap their shields above and around them, creating a mobile armored shell that could advance even under heavy arrow fire. Auxiliary troops complemented the legions. These were non-citizen soldiers recruited from throughout the empire, serving for 25 years and receiving citizenship upon retirement. Auxiliaries provided specialized skills: cavalry from Gaul or Spain, archers from Syria, slingers from the Balearic Islands. This system not only provided Rome with skilled troops, but also integrated conquered peoples into the empire's military structure. The empire's frontiers stretched thousands of miles. In the north, the Rhine and Danube rivers formed natural barriers, but these required constant vigilance. The most famous frontier fortification was Hadrian's Wall in Britain, a stone barrier stretching 73 miles across northern England. Built in the 120s AD, it marked the northwestern limit of the empire and protected the Romanized south from the tribes of Scotland. Along the eastern frontier, Rome faced its most formidable opponent, first the Parthian Empire and later the Sassanid Persians. Unlike the tribal societies of northern Europe, these were sophisticated states with professional armies and developed siege warfare capabilities. The eastern frontier required larger permanent garrisons and more elaborate fortifications. In North Africa, the frontier was less defined, a series of forts and roads extending into the desert. Here, Rome used mobile forces to police the tribes and protect the fertile coastal regions where grain was grown to feed the empire. Life on the frontiers was hard but offered opportunities. Veterans often settled nearby after retirement, creating communities that blended Roman and local cultures. Frontier towns became trading posts where goods and ideas flowed between the empire and the peoples beyond. Many future emperors rose from frontier armies, men like Trajan from Spain or Septimius Severus from Africa. The frontiers were also laboratories of cultural exchange. Roman soldiers stationed in Egypt adopted local gods. Germanic auxiliaries brought their customs to Britain. This constant mixing created a dynamic, evolving civilization that was distinctly Roman yet also diverse and adaptive. But the frontiers also represented a fundamental challenge. They required enormous military resources to defend. The cost of maintaining hundreds of thousands of soldiers along thousands of miles of border strained the empire's finances. And as the quality of those soldiers declined in later centuries, as training became less rigorous and discipline less strict, the frontiers became increasingly vulnerable to the pressure of migrating peoples. When we think of Roman contributions to world culture, perhaps nothing is more immediate than their architectural and engineering achievements. The Romans did not invent concrete, but they perfected it, creating a material stronger and more durable than anything available before. Roman concrete, made from volcanic ash mixed with lime and aggregate, could set even underwater, allowing the construction of harbors, bridges, and foundations that have lasted 2,000 years. This technological mastery enabled construction on a scale that awed the ancient world. Consider the Pantheon, rebuilt by Hadrian in the 120s AD. Its dome, spanning 142 feet in diameter, remained the largest concrete dome in the world until the 20th century. The oculus, the circular opening at the dome's apex, illuminates the interior with ever-changing light. Walking into the Pantheon is still a breathtaking experience, a visceral demonstration of Roman ambition and skill. Roman aqueducts brought fresh water from mountain springs to cities dozens of miles away. The principle was simple: gravity flow, but the execution required extraordinary precision. The gradient had to be maintained consistently, typically dropping only a few inches per mile. The Aqua Claudia, one of Rome's major aqueducts, ran for 45 miles, most of it underground, but including dramatic elevated sections where it crossed valleys on massive arched bridges. The Pont du Gard in southern France demonstrates Roman engineering at its finest. This three-tiered aqueduct bridge, standing 160 feet tall, carried water across the Garden River. Built without mortar, its stones precisely cut and fitted, it has stood for 2,000 years and still inspires wonder. Roman roads were equally impressive. The famous saying, "All roads lead to Rome," reflected reality. The Romans built over 250,000 miles of roads throughout the empire. These were not simple dirt tracks, but engineered highways with cambered surfaces for drainage, multiple layers of foundation, and stone paving. Many of these roads are still in use today, the modern highways following routes laid down 2 millennia ago. The roads served multiple purposes. They enabled rapid movement of armies to trouble spots. They facilitated trade, allowing goods to move efficiently from province to province. They carried the Roman postal system, which could deliver messages hundreds of miles in a matter of days. And they were symbols of Roman power, straight lines cutting through the landscape, proclaiming Roman dominance over nature itself. Roman architecture was not just functional, but symbolic. Buildings made statements about power, piety, and cultural sophistication. The Forum of Trajan, completed in 113 AD, covered over 300,000 square feet and included libraries, shops, a basilica, and Trajan's Column, which rose over 100 feet and was decorated with a spiral frieze depicting the emperor's campaigns in Dacia. The message was clear. Rome was prosperous, powerful, and destined to rule. Amphitheaters in provincial cities imitated the Colosseum, though on a smaller scale. Theaters hosted Greek-style dramatic performances. Temples, bathhouses, forums all proclaimed that this city, though far from Rome, was part of the civilized world, sharing in Roman culture and Roman prosperity. Roman art drew heavily from Greek models but developed its own character. While Greek sculpture emphasized ideal beauty, Roman portraits were often brutally realistic, showing wrinkles, warts, and individual features. This tradition of verism reflected Roman values. They admired experience, wisdom, age. An old senator with a weathered face demonstrated gravitas, seriousness, and dignity. The Romans excelled at historical narrative relief sculpture. Trajan's column and the Arch of Titus preserve detailed depictions of military campaigns showing soldiers, battles, sieges, and triumphs. These were not just art, but propaganda and historical records designed to immortalize imperial achievements and inspire loyalty. Mosaic work reached extraordinary heights in the Roman Empire. Tiny tesserae, squares of colored stone or glass, were assembled into complex images covering floors and walls. The Alexander mosaic from Pompeii, depicting Alexander the Great's victory over the Persians, consists of over 1.5 million pieces and achieves effects comparable to painting. Literature flourished as well. Virgil's Aeneid became Rome's national epic, a sophisticated work that both celebrated Roman destiny and questioned the cost of empire. Ovid's Metamorphoses collected myths into a playful, subversive narrative. Tacitus wrote histories that analyzed the corruption of power with penetrating psychological insight. Seneca's philosophical works explored Stoic ethics. These works were not just read in their own time, but studied throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, shaping Western literature and thought. The traditional narrative of Rome's fall presents it as a sudden catastrophe, barbarian hordes sweeping away a great civilization in an orgy of destruction. The reality was far more complex and gradual. Rome did not fall so much as transform, and the process took centuries. The 3rd century crisis revealed deep structural problems. The empire was simply too large to govern effectively from a single center. Communication was slow, taking weeks for messages to travel from the frontiers to Rome. Military emergencies on one frontier could not be addressed without weakening defenses elsewhere. The economy, dependent on conquest and slavery, struggled when expansion stopped. Diocletian's reforms addressed some of these problems but created others. Dividing the empire between multiple emperors improved governance but also multiplied the centers of power, leading to rivalry and civil war. His price controls failed to curb inflation and led to black markets and economic distortions. His expansion of the bureaucracy created jobs for administrators, but increased the tax burden on ordinary people. Constantine's conversion to Christianity fundamentally altered the empire's character. The traditional gods who had protected Rome for 1,000 years were abandoned. Ancient temples fell into disrepair or were converted to churches. Pagan intellectuals saw this as betrayal, arguing that Rome's misfortunes were punishment for abandoning the old gods. The question of heresy became a major political issue. Christianity was not monolithic. Different theological schools argued about the nature of Christ, the Trinity, and other doctrines. These were not merely academic debates. Emperors called church councils to establish orthodoxy, and those who disagreed with the official position faced persecution. Religious unity, which Constantine had hoped Christianity would provide, proved elusive. The Germanic migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries were driven by complex factors. The Huns, a nomadic people from the Asian steppes, pushed westward, driving other tribes before them. These tribes, the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Burgundians, sought refuge within the empire's borders. Some came as refugees, others as invaders, but all needed land and resources. Rome initially tried to accommodate them, settling tribes within the empire as federati, allied peoples who provided military service in exchange for land. But the numbers were too great, and tensions mounted. The Visigoths, after years of mistreatment by Roman officials, revolted. At Adrianople in 378, they destroyed a Roman army and killed the emperor. It was a watershed. Rome could no longer defend its frontiers. The sack of Rome in 410 by the Visigoths under Alaric shocked the Mediterranean world. How could the eternal city fall? Augustine's City of God provided one answer. Earthly cities rise and fall, but the City of God, the Church and its faithful, endures forever. This shift in perspective helped people cope with Rome's decline. If the empire was not eternal, if it was merely another temporal power, then its fall, while tragic, was not catastrophic to one's ultimate salvation. The final collapse of the Western Empire was almost anticlimactic. A succession of weak emperors ruled from Ravenna, not Rome, controlling little beyond Italy, and sometimes not even that. Germanic generals held real power, making and unmaking emperors. When Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus in 476 and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer needed an emperor, he was acknowledging a reality that had existed for decades. Yet in many ways, Rome continued. The Eastern Emperor still ruled from Constantinople and would continue to do so for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman culture. In the West, the Germanic kingdoms that emerged maintained Roman legal codes, used Latin as their administrative language, and often styled themselves as successors to Rome. The Catholic Church preserved Latin learning and Roman administrative structures. The ideal of a universal empire persisted, influencing Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire and beyond. As we come to the end of our journey through Roman history, it is worth reflecting on why Rome continues to fascinate us 2,000 years after the height of its power. Part of the answer lies in the sheer scale of Roman achievements. They built structures that still stand. They created a body of law that still influences us. They wrote literature that we still read. They established political concepts that we still debate. But perhaps the deeper reason is that Rome's story feels universal. It is the story of how a small community can grow into a great power through determination, innovation, and the willingness to learn from others. It is the story of how success can create new problems, how growth can undermine the very qualities that made growth possible. It is the story of how institutions can both enable and constrain human ambition. The Romans themselves were deeply conscious of their history. They saw themselves as inheritors of a great tradition, and they felt the weight of responsibility to live up to the example of their ancestors. The phrase mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, expressed this sense of obligation to the past. Roman boys learned the stories of heroes like Cincinnatus, who left his plough to save Rome and then returned to his farm, refusing power. They memorized the 12 tables. They studied the speeches of Cicero and the histories of Livy. This historical consciousness shaped Roman identity. To be Roman was not just a matter of where you were born or who your parents were. It was to be part of a continuous story, to uphold certain values, to fulfill certain obligations. When the empire granted citizenship to all free inhabitants in 212 AD, it was opening this identity to everyone. Some of Rome's greatest contributions were not technological or political, but moral and philosophical. The Stoic philosophy that flourished in Rome taught that virtue consists in living according to reason and nature, that we should focus on what is within our control and accept what is not, that we are all citizens of the world, members of a universal human community. These ideas, articulated by thinkers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, continue to resonate today. Rome also gave us enduring symbols and metaphors. Crossing the Rubicon means passing a point of no return. A Pyrrhic victory is one won at too great a cost. When we speak of someone fiddling while Rome burns, we invoke the legend of Nero. These phrases, drawn from Roman history, have become part of how we understand our own experiences. The physical remains of Rome still draw millions of visitors each year. To walk through the Forum is to walk where Caesar walked, where Cicero spoke, where ordinary Romans gathered to conduct business and gossip and argue about politics. The Colosseum, the Pantheon, the aqueducts, these are not just ancient ruins, but connections to a living past. Perhaps most fundamentally, Rome reminds us that great civilizations are not inevitable or permanent. They must be built, and they can be destroyed. The factors that led to Rome's fall, overextension, inequality, political dysfunction, the decay of civic virtue, these are challenges that every society faces. We study Rome not just to admire its achievements, but to learn from its failures. And so we reach the end of our journey through the history of Rome, from the legendary she-wolf nursing twin boys on the banks of the Tiber to the fall of the Western Empire and beyond. We have witnessed the birth of the Republic, the conquest of the Mediterranean, the transformation into an empire, and the long, complex decline. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander through the streets of ancient Rome. Imagine the Forum at midday, filled with citizens in togas conducting business under the watchful gaze of the gods. Picture the triumph of a victorious general processing through streets carpeted with flowers while crowds roar their approval. Envision the quiet of a Roman villa at sunset, with the sound of fountains in the courtyard and the scent of herbs from the garden. Rome's story is, in many ways, the story of Western civilization itself, all its glories and all its flaws. It is a story worth remembering, worth pondering, worth passing down to future generations. The Romans would have approved. They believed deeply in the importance of memory, of honoring the past, of learning from those who came before. So, sleep well and dream of marble columns gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, of legions marching along straight Roman roads, of senators debating the fate of nations, of a civilization that shaped our world in ways we still feel every day. Dream of Rome, the eternal city. Thank you for listening. Good night.